and yours, and welcome into the PHLY Phillies podcast. Thanks so much for hanging out with us on this beautiful Friday in Philadelphia. And I know this weekend's supposed to be like weirdly cold for like 2 days, but I am looking out the window. I see blue skies, which is something we haven't seen in a while. I see warm, and I am super excited to start my weekend, and I hope you are as well. But before we do that, let's talk some Phillies baseball, because today's an anniversary of sorts. A happy anniversary to Bryce Harper. 6 years ago today, we got the news that Bryce Harper was signing a 13-year, $330 million, no trade clause, no opt-out contract with the Phillies. It was a commitment to a team at the time that wasn't monetarily invested the way that it has been over the last couple of years. It was a commitment to a team that was coming out of a rebuild. If you remember 2015, 2016, 2017, I think the one year they won 63 games, one year maybe 71. There were some dreadful baseball teams. And we talked about it on our VOD yesterday where we were going through the opening day lineups. Like, there are people that you just don't remember because the teams were so bad. But it was kind of the turning point of a return to form for the Phillies. Because the Phillies had a 4 or 5 year window from 2007 to 2011, 5-year window where they won the division 5 consecutive years. And after that, it was kind of downhill from there. The signing of Bryce Harper signaled a culmination, or maybe a start, of this team's willingness to spend money. A few weeks prior to Bryce Harper signing, the Phillies traded for JT Realmuto and then had subsequent moves throughout the last couple of years that have put them in position to win 95 games last year, to go to the World Series in 2022, to be in Game 7 of the NLCS in 2023. We don't have to talk about how it ended, but it happened. And to be in the playoffs each of the last 3 seasons, and to have expectations this year of being in the playoffs once again. Whether it's a division winner or a wild card berth, the expectations for the Phillies are that the team will be a playoff team once again. So Bryce Harper's signing was a massive deal. I remember exactly where I was when it was announced that Bryce Harper signed. I was a producer at 97.5 at the time. I was getting ready to work with our PHLY Sixers host, Devon Givens. He and I did nights back then. And I was at the station ready to kind of get the show started. And I was doing my work and listening to, at the time, it was the Mike Missinelli show with Tyrone Johnson and Natalie Eganoff. And I remember Natalie coming on and breaking the news that the Phillies had signed Bryce Harper. And it was like a what do I do moment. It was like, Ricky Bobby, what do I do with my hands type of thing. That's where I felt. Like, obviously there was excitement. Obviously there was intrigue. But it didn't feel like real life for a while. Because it was that perennial, quintessential Philadelphia Phillies sports fan of, oh my God, this guy picked us. This guy picked us. Picked this city. Picked this team. He could have gone anywhere. There were offers from the Giants. There were offers from the Nationals that, deferred money till the year 7,000. It was kind of the Shohei contract before the Shohei contract. But there was that realization of this superstar picked the Phillies. And it kind of dawned on me last night. The Phillies have not had a run of success in free agency until really the turn of the millennium. Now, free agency is still, I don't want to say it's in its infancy anymore, but it's still a relatively new concept. Curt Flood is is notoriously known as the guy that got free agency started with the St. Louis Cardinals. But it's still for a sport that's over 100 closing in on 150 years old, it's still just about a 50-year-old experience. And it's really taken shape in the last 25 years or so. We'll talk about one contract and specifically during today's show that you laugh at monetarily speaking, but it was just how free agency and the money worked in baseball at the time. So it got me thinking about the Phillies' history with free agency. And today what I wanted to do was talk about the top 5 free agent signings in Phillies history. And there's going to be recency bias to this, not just to the current team, but I think, again, within the last 20 years or so, because of the fact that the Phillies really weren't monetary players in free agency for a bulk of, the beginning portions of free agency. Some names signed here and there, but the standout monetary investments have come since really the year 2000. and specifically the year 2003. So over the last 25 years, the Phillies have become players in the free agent market, and I think that it's due in part to one player in particular. But let's talk about the top 5 free agent signings in Phillies history, and we are going to start at number 5. The number 5 free agent signing in Phillies history is a current player. It's Kyle Schwarber. Kyle Schwarber signed a 4-year deal in 2022 for just shy of $80 million. And Kyle Schwarber had a tumultuous, weird ending to his time in Chicago with the Cubs. He was a once promising prospect who had an excellent start to his career, and the strikeout rate started to take hold. The low batting average started to take hold. And when Kyle Schwarber left Chicago, he was non-tendered by the Cubs. And when Kyle Schwarber left Chicago, he signed a 1-year deal with the Washington Nationals for $7 million. Schwarber had a resurgent season in Washington in 2021. The Nats really weren't going anywhere, and so they traded Schwarber to the Boston Red Sox at the trade deadline, who were a good team at the time. It was an attempt to help them, win a World Series. And I thought it was a good move for the Red Sox when they made it. Now, the Red Sox inevitably ended up losing to the Astros in the ALCS, but Kyle Schwarber had a fairly decent postseason for the Red Sox. He picked up 9 hits, had 3 home runs. He drove in 6. Faltered in the ALCS like much of the Red Sox lineup did, as the Astros were on their way to a World Series appearance in 2021. But that left Kyle Schwarber as an unrestricted free agent, really for the first time, a true unrestricted free agent for the first time in his major league career. And the Phillies offered him a 4-year deal for $79 million. And there were questions about what Kyle Schwarber is going to show up in Philadelphia. Would you get a Kyle Schwarber that was more reminiscent of the early portions of his Chicago career and the guy that you saw in Washington and in Boston in 2021? Or would you get Kyle Schwarber that really, really struggled with the shortened COVID season in 2020? His numbers were down across the board. The guy that, had health issues, was out for a majority of 2026 and then made a heroic or 2016, and then made a heroic return for the postseason for the Cubs in 2016 on their way to a World Series title. There was a lot of questions about what Kyle Schwarber would you get. Schwarber has emerged as a catalyst. He's emerged as a guy who delivers. We talked about Kyle Schwarber in the show on Friday as to why I still believe Schwarber should be the leadoff hitter. Now, you're going to look at the .221 average across his first 3 years in Philly, and it's not the thing that jumps out to you. But what jumps out to me is despite the fact that he's had a .221 average, his OBP is over 120 points higher. His slugging over the course of the last 3 years is close to 500. He's hit 131 home runs and driven in 302 runs. He's delivered for this team. In 2022, it was an immediate impact. He hit 46 home runs, led the National League in that number. He was elected to an All-Star game. He was awarded a Silver Slugger. Now, I get it. He was also leading the league in strikeouts that year and the following year for that matter as well. But the impact that Schwarber has had on this lineup has been felt basically since the moment he stepped foot in Philadelphia. Only Aaron Judge and Shohei Ohtani have more home runs since Kyle Schwarber has joined the Phillies. Judge, Ohtani, Matt Olson, Jose Ramirez, and Pete Alonso are the only players to have more RBI over that time. Kyle Schwarber, as you saw, is also 6th in runs scored in that time frame, and only Aaron Judge and Juan Soto have more walks in that time. Now, I mentioned this last week. Schwarber hit 38 home runs last year, which was the least in a season as a Philly. He's averaged 43 a season since joining the team. He also walked 106 times on average over the course of those 3 years, including over 120 this past season. He's averaged about just under 700 plate appearances per year as a Philly. So if you take the walks and add them to the home runs, we talked about this on last Friday, he's 21% of his plate appearances are ending in either a walk or a home run. So right off the rip, that's 1/5 or more of his plate appearances on average per season are ending in those numbers. Kyle Schwarber has been a catalyst for this team in the 3 years that he's been here. I don't think there's any denying that. And whether Schwarber hits first, second, 4th in this upcoming season. I think he'll continue to be a catalyst for this team. It's going to be interesting what happens in at the end of this year. We have a long way to go. It's still February. We haven't even gotten to the beginning of the season yet. It's 162 games, and obviously health plays an important factor. He's been relatively healthy since joining this team. I'll be super, super interested to see what happens in the offseason next year. Kyle Schwarber becomes an unrestricted free agent at the end of next year. He'll also be getting older, but he's shown no sign of diminishing returns. What does a free agent contract look like for Kyle Schwarber, and is it with the Phillies? I would love for Schwarber to return, but the money has to match up, and I think that that's going to be a conversation for later down the road. But I think for right now, over the first 3 years and heading into the final year of his 4-year deal, Kyle Schwarber's been a steal for the Phillies. At just shy of $20 million per year, you've penciled into your lineup every day a guy who is going to hit close to 40 home runs, a guy who's going to have a 340, 350 on-base percentage, and a guy who you know is going to strike out a lot, yes, but he's going to be a catalyst for this team. He had 15 leadoff home runs last year. 13 times in those games, the Phillies won. Kyle Schwarber is the number 5 free agent signing in the history of the Phillies franchise. Let's get to number 4. Number 4 is Jim Thome. Jim Thome's time in Philly was short. It was just 3 seasons. And realistically, it was only 2 seasons because his final year, he only played 59 games. He dealt with injuries. He ended up turning things over to Ryan Howard, who it ended up being a great move for the Phillies. Howard won the National League Rookie of the Year in 2006. He was the MVP in 2008. Or, excuse me, he was the MVP in 2000. Is it 2006? Maybe 2005, he was the Rookie of the Year. 2006, he was the MVP because then J. Roll won the MVP in 2007. But I think Jim Thome's impact on this city in two full seasons goes beyond stats. And we'll get to that in just a second. But let's take a look at Jim Thome's actual numbers first in his 3 years here. Thome was an established star when he signed in Philly. He signed a 6-year deal, ended up only being here for 3 years, but he signed a 6-year deal with the Phillies worth $85 million in 2003. Over the course of his 3 years, he slashed 260, 386, and 543, hit almost 100 home runs and drove in 266. And more importantly, he was the exact kind of guy that the Phillies needed at that time. Bobby Abreu was entrenched as the 3-hole for this team. They needed another guy who was going to be a middle of the lineup run producer, guy who could drive runs in, and that's exactly what Jim Thome was. By the time he had signed in Philly, he had already been an established star. He had 330 home runs, drove in nearly 1,000 runs in his first 11 seasons in Cleveland, most of which, by the way, came really from 94 to 02. So you're talking about an 8 or 9 year sample size, even though he had been a major league player for 11 seasons. He was a 3-time All-Star and finished in the top 7 of MVP voting 3 times with Cleveland at the time. So when he signed in Philly, it was a huge, huge deal. And kind of like a lot of these guys on the list, Thome rewarded the Phillies statistically, specifically in 03 and 04. And as I mentioned, legitimate pop in the middle of the lineup that the Phillies really, really needed at the time because they were struggling offensively. Scott Rowland had departed, and it was really just Bobby Abreu and a bunch of guys, and of course Jimmy Rollins at the top of the lineup. But in terms of pop, they needed somebody to fill that void. Let's take a look at 2003 and 2004 specifically. As I mentioned, Thome was limited to just 59 games in 05 and eventually usurped by Ryan Howard. But in the first 2 years, 2003 and 2004, Jim Thome hit 89 home runs. Only Barry Bonds had more home runs in that 2-year span, and Albert Pujols was tied with Thome for 89. He was also 6th in RBI, driving in 236. There were only 5 players who had more. Surprisingly, at the top of the list was Miguel Tejada. I forgot how good Miguel Tejada was over that stretch. And then a bunch of dudes who were just perennial power hitters. Gary Sheffield, Albert Pujols, David Ortiz, and Carlos Delgado. And on top of his power, Jim Thome was 5th in walks. His walk rate was 6th best in Major League Baseball at 15.6%. Both of those things are amazing. I want to step aside for just 1 second. and just talk about the utter ridiculousness of Barry Bonds over those 2 years. Thome was sixth in walk rate, at 15.6%. Barry Bonds led the league at 32.6%. What? His on-base percentage over that 2-year stretch, I'm gonna talk to you for a second. Talk directly into the camera. His on-base percentage over that 2-year stretch was .572. .572. He was on base more than half of his plate appearances for a 2-year stretch. That is ridiculous. And I believe in that time frame was the year that Barry Bonds walked more than he had at bats. You know, he was getting intentionally walked a ton. It was coming off the precipice of his 72 home run year. He was getting intentionally walked with the bases loaded at times. But just to put that into perspective, Jim Thome had a 15.6% walk rate, which is excellent, by the way. Finished sixth across Major League Baseball over a 2-year sample size. Barry Bonds was at 32%. That's ridiculous. All right, let's get back to Jim Thome for just a second. Numerically, Jim Thome was super, super important to this team. But I think the impact of Jim Thome off the field is even more immeasurable and honestly probably more important. The Phillies were a team that notably wasn't willing to spend a ton of money prior to Jim Thome signing with the Phillies. In 2002, the Phillies had the 17th highest paid payroll. In 2001, they were 24th. Go back to 2000, they were 20th. They just simply didn't spend a lot of money. The Scott Rowland saga happened. They had traded Curt Schilling. Jimmy Rollins still wasn't making a ton of money at the time. And the next wave of stars hadn't emerged yet. The Phillies just really weren't spending any money. It was just basically Bobby Abreu. And then they spent some money on guys like Kevin Millwood and things like that over the next couple of years. But Jim Thome signed in 2003, and the Phillies' payroll jumped to 15th in baseball. Took a small jump from 02 to 03. Took a sizable jump from 03 to 04. They were the fifth highest paid payroll in baseball in 2004. Thome filled a quota for Philadelphia fans who yearned that Bryce Harper like he chose us. But I think signing Thome signaled a landscape shift in David Montgomery's willingness to spend, and he opened the door for future free agents to view Philadelphia as like an actual destination. Listen, of course it helped that Ryan Howard and Jimmy Rollins and Chase Utley and Cole Hamels were all stars and the team was able to build organically alongside the money that they spent. But I think Thome signing in Philadelphia created a shockwave that not just signaled that turn of the corner for the Phillies like 03 to 05 to 08 to 10, but I think it's still being felt. I think that ripple effect is still being felt to this day across Philadelphia. Jim Thome signing in Philly was massively important for this franchise. Remember, this is the losingest franchise in the history of sports. Not baseball, not American sports. It is the losingest franchise in the history of sports. It was the first franchise to 10,000 losses in franchise history. This is a bad franchise over the course of its tenure, with some good years sprinkled in. Dating back to 2007, when the Phillies had a 5-year run of winning the division, do you know how many times the Phillies made the playoffs? It's like 7, 15, 50. Now, granted, again, in those years, you either went to the World Series or you missed the playoffs. But they made the playoffs in 15, in 50, and then they didn't make the playoffs again until 1976. They made the playoffs in 76, 77, and 78, missed the playoffs in 79. We'll talk about those teams in just a second, before winning the World Series for the first time in 1980. This is an organization that began in 1883, and they had been to the playoffs 5 times between 1883 and 1978. This is not a good organization historically, but what they've been able to do in recent years specifically, and in that stretch from 7 to 11, is spend money, and Jim Thome is a really important piece to that conversation. All right, before we get into our top 3, and specifically Bryce Harper and where he falls in on this list, let's step away for just a moment. We'll take a moment to tell you about some of our friends here at PHLY. And let's start with our friends over at Bet365 because signing Jim Thome and Bryce Harper wasn't ordinary, and it's never ordinary at Bet365. Bet365 has 90 million users worldwide and live streams 780,000 events each year. But the best thing about Bet365 to me is the early payout process across the leagues, specifically across the NBA and the NHL. Listen, sometimes you don't want to sweat out a game. Brenna, how about last night? If the Flyers were up 3-0 last night, you know what you would have been able to do on Bet365? You would have cashed out. But the Flyers lost last night. You know why? I don't know why. I'm still trying to figure it out. But Brenna unfortunately had to, who's producing today, by the way, Brenna and Joey are producing today, had to unfortunately produce last night's Flyers postgame show. You wouldn't have had to worry about the Flyers, your bet at least, because you would have cashed out with a 3-goal lead in the NHL. And in the NBA, if your team's up 20 points, you can cash out early as well. Incredible offers across Bet365 and new customers right now. Breaking news for new customers. If you sign up, you're going to get $150 in bonus bets when you bet $5, win or lose. So sign up and use the code PHLY365 and deposit $10 and just place a bet for $5 and you'll get $150 back in bonus bets, whether you win or lose. Those bonus bets can be used on spreads, totals, player props, futures, and so much more. No matter what the event, it's never ordinary at Bet365. Must be 21 and physically located in PA. If you or someone you know has a gambling problem and wants help, call 1-800-GAMBLER. Let's talk about Rothman for a second. Rothman is probably where one of our other producers is going to be headed in the coming days. Andrew Frazier was telling us about his shoulder and his neck. It's a mess right now. I don't know if it's a pinched nerve or if it's a joint thing or a muscle thing, but Andrew said he's having a tough time sleeping. He's having a tough time sitting upright. So he's going to see some specialists today, and he's going with our friends over at Rothman Orthopedics because they have been practicing specialized medicine for over 50 years. Their mission is high quality, compassionate, and affordable care that is rooted in research that leads to new treatments and better outcomes. And their docs are focused on their specialty. Whether it's your hip, your knee, your spine, you name it, Rothman has a team for every body part right in your backyard. So, since 1970, their physicians have remained committed to that research, that innovation, and specifically minimally invasive procedures that get you back on your feet as quickly as possible. Year after year, Rothman consistently performs among the highest volume of hip, knee, shoulder, and ankle replacements in the country. They've done over 60,000. And for more than 50 years, Rothman has participated in thousands of groundbreaking research and clinical trials with the goal of advancing knowledge, developing treatments, and improving outcomes for the benefit of their patients. Rothman Orthopedics, specializing in orthopedics, and you. Visit rothmanortho.com/PHLY to learn more and make your appointment today. Welcome back to the PHLY Phillies podcast here on PHLY. Of course, I want to send a shout out to everybody in the chat. K-Red, Scott, Steve Garrison, Terry, everybody that's joined along with us throughout the show. We appreciate you very much. Steve, I know you brought up some of the players that you think are going to be in this list. You have Harper and Wheeler top 2 and 3rd at Jim Thome. I had Thome at 4. Just to recap, Kyle Schwarber was 5. Jim Thome was 4. We're going to get to 3 in just a second. Terry says Pete Rose, until Bryce hoists the World Series trophy, it will remain Rose. We may or may not just talk about Pete Rose in just a second. Scott says the Phillies only need 560 more wins to get back to 500. That's only 4 straight seasons of basically being undefeated. That's no big deal. And I think we're sharing and commiserating in our Flyers misery in the chat as well. K-Red says, I honestly think the Penguins hit rock bottom last night, and then the Pens somehow rallied. Ben Ace appreciates you. BC, welcome back to the chat. Yes, I know the Dodgers are going to be the best team in baseball this year, and their deferred contracts are going to set them back until 2085 when Shohei Ohtani's 75 years old. Let's get back to but they're probably going to win the World Series this year, so it'll be worth it. Excuse me. Let's get back to our list here for just a second. The number 3 player in the top 5 best free agent signings in Phillies sports history is Pete Rose. Listen, anytime you have the conversation about Pete Rose, the player off the field is. I do not condone the actions of Pete Rose in any capacity. I have spoken openly and adamantly about Pete Rose, the human being. He is somebody that I will not speak highly of as a person, and his actions are reprehensible. And I think you have to put that caveat when you talk about Pete Rose, because Pete Rose was a very, very flawed human being. And I do not condone nor agree with a lot of the things that Pete Rose did as a person. All right. But I think that when you have a list like this, you do have to include Pete Rose on this conversation. Pete Rose, the baseball player, was important to the Phillies landscape, especially for a team that was seemingly hitting a wall or up against a rut in the mid 1970s. Rose joined the Phillies in 1979 as what kind of felt like the final piece of a puzzle for a team that was so close to knocking on the doorstep of a World Series contention in 3 of the last 4 years. They had gone to the NLCS 3 straight years, 1976 through 78, and had lost each of those 3 years to the Dodgers or Pete Rose's Reds. 1979 was a weird year for the Phillies because they signed Rose, and the expectation was that they were going to be in the conversation of World Series contenders. Pete Rose signed a 4-year deal for what was just, I believe it was $3.2 million at the time, which now when you consider monetarily speaking, it's like, even with inflation, those numbers are just super, super low compared to what players are getting over the course of free agency now. But 1979 was a weird year for the Phillies. They missed the playoffs. Pitching was a mess. They had a lot of injury issues. Danny Ozark got fired. They brought in Dallas Green. I think 1979 was a collective failure for the Phillies as a team. But 1980 was an entirely different team. They won 91 games. Mike Schmidt won his first of consecutive MVPs, and of course, the team culminated the season with a World Series run, and Pete Rose was part of being a catalyst for this team. He played all 162 games during the regular season and led Major League Baseball in doubles. He also finished 11th in hits that year with 185. He was a 1980 All-Star, and I think a lot of people remember Pete Rose in the World Series specifically for the play that he made along the dugout where the ball popped out of Bob Boone's glove, the catcher, and Pete Rose secured it for an important out down the stretch in the World Series. You see his numbers there over his 5-year stretch with the Phillies. He hit 291/291, 365, 361. Obviously was not a power hitter, was more of a contact singles hitter, just 8 home runs. But he led Major League Baseball in his 5 years in games played with 745, and he was 9th in hits with 826. He was a 4-time All-Star, and the only time that he didn't make the All-Star team with the Phillies was in 1983 in his year 42 season. If you remove that year, Pete Rose was 3rd in hits from 79 to 82 and was 3rd in strikeout rate with a 4.6% strikeout rate. Some probably would argue that Pete Rose should be higher on this list, like Terry mentioned, because Pete Rose won a World Series with the team, and the 2 guys that are ahead of him have yet to do that. And in fact, the 2 guys that were behind him haven't done that either with the Phillies. But I think the statistical and roster construction merit to the 2 guys that are ahead of Pete Rose, paired with what has become, listen, you can have monetary conversations, and you're never going to be able to fairly comp what a free agent signed in 1976 for what a player signed, in 2022. Pete Rose's 4-year deal in 1976 was seen as a high deal. In fact, he became the highest paid player in baseball in 1976, and he made on average $800,000 per season. The highest paid player in baseball per year this season coming up is going to be Juan Soto. He's going to make $61 million per year. It's an entirely different landscape. So you can only have the conversation within the construct of the years that the player's contract was signed. And when Pete Rose signed for that deal, he was the highest paid player in baseball. When the 2 guys ahead of him have signed their deals, never once were they the highest paid player in baseball. Now, one of the guys coming up is going to be one of the higher paid players this year because he's since signed another contract extension. But I think all of these things paired together to tell you why Pete Rose finishes in 3rd on this list, and there's 2 guys ahead of him that are going to finish within the top 2. All right, let's get to number 2 on this list. The number 2 free agent signing in Phillies franchise history is Zack Wheeler. Zack Wheeler has claimed to being number 2. I think Zack Wheeler, from a monetary investment, could very realistically be the best free agent signing in Phillies history. Let's go back to 2015 when Zack Wheeler was a New York Met. Zack Wheeler tore his UCL in 2015. He didn't pitch at all in 2015. He also had complications in 2016 that led to major setbacks that meant that he didn't pitch in the majors in 2016 either. So he didn't pitch in Major League Baseball for 2 consecutive years. And his numbers prior to that were fine. You could tell there was stuff there, but he was an inconsistent starter for the Mets in the time before that. 2017, he made his return to the mound with the Mets and made just 17 starts before he was shut down with elbow problems. He posted a 5.2 ERA that season in 2017. His final year in New York, which was 2019, he posted a near 4 ERA. He had a 3.96 ERA and gave up over 9 hits per 9 innings pitched and had a whip that was well above 1.2, which actually to that point was his second best of his career. Listen, it's no secret that Zack Wheeler struggled with health and consistency in his time in New York. So you talk about a UCL injury and subsequent Tommy John surgery. You talk about the fact that he had setback after setback after setback the following year to try to recover. You talk about the fact that he was inconsistent even in his final season with the New York Mets. It's safe to say that when Zack Wheeler signed an extension or signed a free agent deal with the Phillies, there were question marks surrounding what kind of pitcher Zack Wheeler was going to be. He signed a deal that was worth $118 million. In that same season, the Phillies courted Patrick Corbin. Patrick Corbin was a guy that a lot of people wanted. Take a look at their numbers since the two players were signed. Patrick Corbin signed a massive deal in Washington. It's become one of the most albatross contracts in baseball history. When you talk about bad contracts, current bad contracts, I think the conversation is Patrick Corbin and Anthony Rendon. And Rendon is because he can't stay healthy and seemingly hates the game of baseball and doesn't want to play. Patrick Corbin's pitched. He's just pitched poorly. He's been amongst the league's worst in terms of ERA season after season. He's been amongst the league's worst in losses taken per year. He's been amongst the league's worst in many different metrics, including weighted run created and things like that. Patrick ended up being an albatross contract for the Nationals. Those were kind of monetarily the type of contracts the Phillies were looking to sign. Instead, the Phillies turned to Zack Wheeler, and he hasn't disappointed. In his 4 seasons across Philadelphia so far, Zack Wheeler, 4 seasons? 5 seasons. In his 5 seasons, in Philadelphia so far, opponents have hit just .218 collectively and posted a .611 OPS. He has struck out 27% of the hitters that he's faced over that time. And you take a look at the numbers that he's posted. He's 59-32. And you know me, I am not a huge proponent in wins being an ultimatum for starters. However, Zack Wheeler is second in wins since joining the Phillies. Only Framber Valdez has more, and he has 60. He's posted a sub-3 ERA since joining the team and has a near 1 whip since becoming a Philly. He struck out. His next strikeout will be his 900th as a Philly and has a 9.8 strikeouts per 9 ratio since joining the team. He's also held opponents, as I mentioned, to a .218 collective average. He's also been a Cy Young runner-up twice. And you can have the conversation, we've done it plenty, should he have won one in his tenure with the Phillies? Last year, I say no. I think Chris Sale was deserving of being the Cy Young. He was a Triple Crown winner. He had over 220 strikeouts. He was excellent, led the National League in wins, National League in strikeouts, National League in ERA. That's how he gets to the Triple Crown. Zack Wheeler, I think, was excellent last year, but was not the Cy Young winner. You could go back to the year that he finished in second to Corbin Burns. That's where you make your argument. Corbin Burns finished with something like 40 less innings pitched than Zack Wheeler. No disrespect to Corbin Burns. He had an excellent season. Sub-1 whip, strikeout rates were amazing, ERA was great, but he threw a significantly less amount of innings than Zack Wheeler did. Now, Chris Sale last year also threw less innings than Zack Wheeler did, but it was a much less stark number than what Corbin Burnes was at, because remember, he missed a bulk of the early portion of the season recovering from injury. Corbin Burnes was excellent that season. If you want to make the case that Zack Wheeler should have won a Cy Young, it should have been that year, which I believe was 2021, if I remember correctly. But that would have been the year that I think Zack Wheeler would have had claim to the Cy Young. But regardless, Zack Wheeler has actually gotten better as the seasons have gone on. Zack Wheeler in 2022, was 15th among qualified starters in opponent batting average. 2023, he was 13th. Last year, he was second among qualified starters in opponent batting average. Only Astros starter Ronel Blanco had more. Wheeler, since joining the Phillies, is second across Major League Baseball in innings pitched. He's a workhorse. You know who's first? Aaron Nola. The Phillies have 1 and 2 amongst qualified starting pitchers. Well, starting pitchers in general. You don't have to put the qualification on this one. The Phillies are 1 and 2 in innings pitched for starting pitchers since Zack Wheeler has joined the Phillies back in 2020. That's workhorse mentality from the top of your rotation. That is giving your bullpen a day off, not just a day off, but potentially 2. And if Christopher Sanchez can continue to build on the success that he had in 2024, if Ranger Suarez stays healthy, if Jesus Luzardo, who, by the way, I think somebody in the chat was mentioning was touching 98 today in a spring training start, if he can stay healthy, this is one of the deepest rotations in baseball. And it's a rotation that I think is going to take some of the onus off of the Phillies bullpen this year, which I have been on the record many times saying is a little more volatile than it was last year. It's chaotic. At the top of the line, or at the top of the bullpen, how many guys do you have inherent trust in? That number was 3 or 4 last year. This year, it may only be 2. And so when you have volatility within your bullpen, Jordan Romano coming off the big injury, what does a bounce back from Jose Alvarado look like? Does Jose Ruiz have another good year? All of those things provide you volatility. To have a starting rotation that is this deep is super, super important to this team. And Zack Wheeler headlines it. Zack Wheeler has been the best starting pitcher in baseball over the last few years, and he just continues to get better. Let me give you some more numbers for Wheeler. He's 6th amongst qualified starters in ERA since joining the team. His 24.7 WAR is the highest among those starters, and only 5 pitchers have more strikeouts over that time. There's a claim to be made that Zack Wheeler is the best pitcher, the best starting pitcher in baseball right now. That argument is that he's going to clear names like Garrett Cole, Corbin Burnes, Tarek Skubal, everybody on the Seattle Mariners pitching staff, Chris Sale. It's an accomplished list, and I think Wheeler might be the guy to headline it. So Wheeler signed his contract extension this offseason. He is now the second highest paid player by AAV with $42 million per year. The Phillies, who are a team that historically likes to sign longer deals to keep the AAV down, were willing to give Zack Wheeler a shorter-term deal with higher monetary investment because he's heading into his year 35 season. He'll be 38 when this contract expires. He said pretty publicly, at least recently, this may be the end of his career. When he's done this contract, he may end up thinking about retirement. When he does that, or if he does that, he is going to go down as one of the elite pitchers in Phillies history. Now, longevity-wise, right, you talk about Carlton, you talk about Roberts, you go all the way back, you think about guys like Grover Cleveland Alexander, talk about Jim Bunnings in the fold. But I think in terms of electric domination over the course of what will probably turn out to be like an 8-year career with the Phillies, Zack Wheeler is going to be right up amongst the list of Phillies' great starters of all time. Like we talked about last week, I think the big thing for Zack Wheeler, or this week, I think the big thing for Zack Wheeler is fastball location, fastball location, fastball location. He's still throwing 97 when he needs to. He's comfortable sitting in a 94, 95 range to give himself longevity, to stretch himself out over a 32 start sample size, which, by the way, his health has been massively improved since he's joined the Phillies, but he's able to pump it to 97 when he needs to. He works well up in the zone. That drop in the arm slot has allowed for the rise on his fastball, right? It's not gravitational rise, but it's a battle against gravity that pushes that rise up on his fastball. It becomes harder to hit. It's got that upward rotation going on, and it keeps from falling, and which allows it to ride up into the zone. He's great against lefties and righties with his fastball. But I think the other thing, too, we talked about the other day was his splitter. He used it 7% of the time last year. It's not a massive sample size, but it was super, super effective. He throws it primarily to lefties. It's got split change grip. It's got split change movement, and it's got a near 9-mile-an-hour deviation off of his fastball. He continues to get better as he gets older. He's heading into his year 35 season, and quite frankly, I don't think he shows any signs of fatigue. He hasn't shown any signs of slowing down. He hasn't shown any signs that he's any less of a pitcher than he was when the Phillies signed him. And quite frankly, he might be better. And all of that is to say, in terms of like ROI, his return on investment, this might be one of the greatest investments in Phillies history. They got him at $23.5 million per season when they signed him. That ranked 40th across Major League Baseball per AAV. In fact, last year, 4 Phillies players on the roster themselves were paid more than Zack Wheeler. Players that were making more last year than Zack Wheeler include I Hate Baseball, Mr. Anthony Rendon, include the guy we just talked about who's been one of the worst starting pitchers in cross baseball over the last couple of years, includes Patrick Corbin, would have included Steven Strasburg before he decided to retire, Jordan Montgomery, who had a terrible season in Arizona last year and had to opt into his player option for year 2, Javi Baez has become a meme at this point for how badly he swings out of hand. His out of zone chase rates are terrible. A once really promising shortstop has kind of become a meme at this point. And there's a ton of other guys. He ranked 40th last year in AAV. Again, he'll be second this year, only behind Juan Soto, but it's a deserved $42 million. And he's earned every dollar of that contract. Zack Wheeler is one of the greatest return on investments in Phillies franchise history. All right, before we get to number 1, and I'm sure you've figured out who it is at this point, let's pause for just a second and tell you about some of our friends here at PHLY. And we'll start with the company that I am probably the proudest to endorse because it's a company that I use on a daily basis. It's Shady Rays. Shady Rays have some of the best sunglasses and in all of eyewear. Sleek frames, stylish looks, the style and frame that is going to match your look and what you want specifically. I go with the sleeker ones, the ones with the slimmer frames, because listen, I wear a lot of hats. I got big ears and a big head. You got to fit them somewhere, right? You got to fit the frame somewhere along your ears. They're the most comfortable for me. But you can get any kind of pair. You can get a more traditional sunglass look. You can get your aviators. And I know that snow and ski and snowboard season's starting to kind of come to an end a little bit. But the best eye protection in all of eyewear belongs to Shady Rays when it comes to snow goggles. Listen, you don't want glare off the sun. Sunburn on your eyes off of the snow is not a fun thing. So you can get some of the best protection in all of eyewear when it comes to your skiing and snowboarding needs. And the best thing about Shady Rays is twofold. First and foremost, they offer the best protection in all of eyewear. If your pair gets lost, damaged, broken, they have a protection plan in place to get you a new pair of shades or snow goggles. And if you're not happy with your current pair, you have up to 30 days to return them or exchange them worry-free. So listen, sometimes you shop online and you get a product home and they're not exactly what you looked for. They don't fit just quite right. Maybe the lenses aren't exactly what you thought they were. Don't worry about it. Shady Rays understands that that's part of shopping, especially in this digital world. All you got to do, send them back and say, hey, I think I want this pair instead. Shady Rays will take your return, send you your new pair worry-free, up to 30 days. So head on over to shadyrays.com, use the promo code PHLY, and you will get 35% off your first pair of polarized sunglasses. And find out today why 300,000 people, including myself, have given Shady Rays a 5-star rating on shadyrays.com. Let me tell you about our friends over at TrueMark Financial. And when you save money on your Shady Rays, maybe you think about getting some of your credit card debt down if you have some of it for the holiday season. Listen, I know the holidays were over 2 months ago, but if you racked up a bill and you're worried about interest payments, head on over to TrueMark. You have just a couple more hours, actually, because this offer ends today. You have to apply by the end of today, and you can transfer balance any of your credit card or any of your balances from another institution to a TrueMark Financial Visa credit card for no interest. You'll pay 0 interest for the next 12 months. So all of your payments are going to go right to your principal instead of your interest. Listen, as somebody who has a ton of student loans, I know what it's like to get buried in interest. TrueMark wants to help you out in that regard. They're going to offer you 12 months interest-free for 12 months, as I said. And whether you're interested in earning rewards, cash back, or getting that low rate on everyday purchases, TrueMark has the credit card that best fits your financial needs. So visit TrueMark.com/compare for full details and to apply today. TrueMark Financial, federally insured by the NCUA, equal opportunity lender. Terms and conditions apply. All loans subject to approval. 3% balance transfer fee applies. Standard rates apply after the promotional rate. Excuse me for 1 second. Welcome back to the PHLY Phillies podcast. Tyler Zulli here as we talk to you for another 12 minutes or so. Please excuse me. 45 minutes to talk is a very long time. Excuse me. Sorry about that. Thank you for your patience. All right, let's get to the number one free agent signing in Phillies franchise history. No surprise, it's the one we headlined the show with today. It's Bryce Harper. Bryce Harper signed a 13-year, $330 million contract on this day 6 years ago. And I have to tell you, it stands as one of the best free agent signings in team history. In fact, it is the best free agent signing in team history. In 2029, before we even get to the stats, let's talk about the money for a second. In 2029, Bryce Harper made just $11 million on his contract. It was just part of how the AAV was structured. But ever since then, Bryce Harper has made about $27 million a year from 2020 all the way until the end of this contract. And quite frankly, this contract gets better and better and better over time. Let's go and take a look at some of the AAVs per year since 2020 when that $27 million came into play. Bryce Harper was the 15th highest paid player in 2020. 2021, that bumped up slightly to 17th. 2022, it bumped up again another 2 spots to 19th. Stayed stagnant in 2023, it was 19th once again. And in 2024, it bumped up to the 22nd highest paid player per year on average annual salary. And in 2025, this upcoming season, he'll remain as the 22nd highest paid player per AAV. As players continue to reset the market, Harper's $27 million per year will continue to look like an exceptional monetary investment for the Phillies. Listen, I understand at some point Harper's monetary investment is going to be a bell curve, right? It's going to do this. There's the peak. I don't know if he's hit the peak just yet. I don't know if we're starting to hit the downward trend. It still remains to be seen. But at some point, the bell curve is going to come back down the other way. Harper's going to lose a step. He may not be a pliable everyday defensive first baseman. You probably move him to a DH role later in his career. And that is when, that's along the timeline where you expect guys like Aiden Miller to be ready, potentially Justin Crawford, Andrew Painter's up into the rotation. That's a conversation for later down the road. But listen, I always talk about the cost of doing business when you're trying to sign big-time players. $27 million is a lot of money for you and I. $27 million to be the 22nd highest paid player in baseball is not that much from a monetary standpoint. And that $27 million is going to continue to drop as more and more players get the contracts and the extensions that they're looking for. Juan Soto broke baseball last offseason when he signed for an AAV of $61 million. Shohei Ohtani would have been the same case if he didn't have a bunch of deferred money in his contract. The deferred money conversation is going to be in play for a long, long time. And maybe the number of the annual salary starts to come down a little bit for players because of deferred money. But this contract for Bryce Harper just continues to feel like a better and better contract. At some point, his skills are going to dwindle. And in year 10, year 11, year 12, you're going to be saddled with a $27 million contract for a player that maybe isn't any good anymore. I can't tell the future. Bryce Harper can't tell the future. But the realization is time's undefeated, and the likelihood is sometime at some point in the foreseeable future, or in maybe the not so distant future, Bryce Harper is a shell of the player that he was when he signed in 2019 and he won the MVP in 2021, and that's okay. You're paying him on the back end for the production on the front end of this contract. They've done it with Trey Turner. They've done it with, to a lesser extent, guys like Schwarber and Castellanos and JT Realmuto. Those contracts are a little more negotiable and manageable because this is up next year. JT's up this year. But when you sign these long-term double-digit year deals, you're under the impression, with the exception of maybe Juan Soto, because of the fact that Soto was 25 or 24 years old when he signed his long-term deal, you're under the impression that the back end of the contract may not look so favorable in terms of production. But it's the price of doing business when you sign these big-time deals. What you were able to acquire Harper for and what he's being paid for compared to what he's done over the course of his tenure here so far feels like a steal. Let's take a look at Bryce Harper's numbers since he's joined the team. Bryce Harper was the 2021 MVP. He's a 3-time Silver Slugger. Twice he's been elected as a National League All-Star. You see there, he's hit 285/285, 391, 533. He's hit 152 home runs in his time with the Phillies. He's driven in 455 RBIs, runs, and had 455 RBI. We'll talk about the postseason numbers in just a second. But more than that, Bryce Harper ranks 8th across Major League Baseball in walk rate since he signed in Philadelphia at a 14.4%. His .391 on-base percentage trails just Juan Soto, Aaron Judge, Freddie Freeman, and Mike Trout. He's 6th in slugging, trailing only Judge, Trout, Soto, Shohei Ohtani, and Yordan Alvarez. He's 7th across Major League Baseball in OPS. You can add Freddie Freeman to that list. And he's 7th in weighted runs created plus. Bryce Harper statistically has been excellent and everything you could have asked for when he signed with the Phillies back in 2019. And oh yeah, by the way, none of that includes the postseason. Postseason Bryce Harper is a different animal. He is a beast unto himself when he is in the postseason. Listen, you remember the swing of his life, right? That was like an ethereal moment. That was like a levitation moment, right? I think Bryce Harper might have levitated when he hit that home run off of Robert Suarez. I could tell you how it went down, and I'm sure you can too. Big pause. Couple pitches prior, battling off, heavy changeup and high fastball overlay. Robert Suarez throws super hard. Heavy changeup down and away, 90, 91. Wouldn't get Harper to bite. Harper battles to a favorable count. Throws him a pitch that's up in the zone enough. Harper smokes into left field. Bedlam at the bank, the swing of his life, right? If you were on TV, Joe Davis said swing of his life. If you're on radio, Scott Fransky, to me, the best play-by-play guy in the city, bedlam at the bank. You remember all of those things, right? It was literally like an ethereal moment in Phillies history. But past that, he has been clutch for the Phillies in his 3 postseasons for the team. Listen, the team as a whole collectively was underperforming and underwhelming last year against the Mets. Not going to scrape that and totally forget about it. But he was the 2022 NLCS, not surprising. Here are the numbers that really stick out to me. In his 34 postseason games with the Phillies, he's driven in 24 runs, he's hit 12 home runs, and has posted an OPS well over 1.1, as you saw on the screen there. But more importantly, since 2022, over the last 3 postseasons for the Phillies, he has led Major League Baseball with 38 hits. He's led Major League Baseball with doubles, with 9. He's tied for first in home runs with 12. You know who he's tied with? His teammate, Kyle Schwarber. He's also first in weighted runs created with a 36. To put that into perspective, Schwarber and Yordan Alvarez are tied for second with a 26. No other player in baseball over the last 3 years has a 21 or better. Has more than 21. Bryce Harper's statistical impact on the postseason cannot be understated. But I think the tangible impact of Bryce Harper, more than just his statistical numbers, goes well beyond that and into an organizational change. Much like Jim Thome in 2003, Bryce Harper was the catalyst for this team's willingness to spend money and go out and be successful. Weeks before Bryce Harper signed, the Phillies traded for JT Realmuto. That was a sign of, all right, this team means business. They went out and got their everyday all-star Gold Glove catcher, a guy with pop, a guy who could do it on both sides of the plate, a guy at the time who was widely considered for, 3 or 4 years, the best catcher in baseball. They've since extended JT Realmuto. In the time after signing Bryce Harper, they've signed Zack Wheeler and extended him. They've extended Aaron Nola. They've signed Nick Castellanos. They've signed Kyle Schwarber. And most recently, they've signed, to long-term signings at least, signed Trey Turner. They've extended a bunch of their own guys, and they've been amongst the league's most active teams in terms of spending money. We talked about this last week. 2021, they've spent $190 million. They were fifth across baseball. 22, they spent an additional $54 million and were fourth. 23 and 24, $1 million added per year. They were fifth in 23 and fourth in 24, excuse me. And this season coming up, they're going to spend just on payroll $279 million and are third across baseball in all of payroll. You talk about the luxury tax threshold that they've been willing to spend. They're closing in on $300 million spent this season. Bryce Harper has been a tangible and intangible, invaluable piece to this Phillies organization. Harper, paired with the good baseball, has brought fans back in droves to Citizens Bank Park. Fans spend money, fans buy merchandise, fans allowed this organization to spend more money, and in turn provide this team with a pliable product to give this team tangible ability to win baseball games. It hasn't resulted in a World Series yet, but they have been a contender in each of the last 3 seasons, specifically since they've made the postseason. A World Series appearance, an NLCS appearance, and a division title that ended in an unfortunate 95-win division title that ended in an unfortunate end to the season where everybody decided they weren't going to hit it once. But heading into 2025, I see no reason as to why the Phillies shouldn't be a postseason team again. And because of all of this, because of their willingness to spend money, because of the statistical outburst that Bryce Harper has provided, because of the postseason heroics, Bryce Harper is the best free agent signing in Philadelphia Phillies team history. It's a great list, at least in the top 5. After that, you start to get to some less than stellar monetary investments, such as Adam Eaton, Kevin Millwood. I believe they acquired Freddie Garcia. That was a disaster. But those 5 guys, to me, signal the 5 best free agent signings in Phillies history. Honorable mention goes out to a guy who signed a super cheap deal because he was unheralded at the time, former high draft pick, was Jayson Werth. Jayson Werth was the guy that I thought just missed this list. But Jayson Werth was not expected to be an everyday starter. Jayson Werth was signed as depth. He proved to be a much better player than what the Phillies could have bargained for and got a massive contract extension or a massive contract with the Washington Nationals when his contract was up. By the way, shout out to everybody who watched along on our streaming services. Thank you to everybody on our Roku, Samsung, all of our streaming services. We appreciate you greatly. Head on over to allphly.com to watch the rest of the show. Not much left in the show. That is pretty much going to wrap this thing up. But that is our top 5. Brennan, if you wouldn't mind just flashing the graphic one more time of what I believe to be the top 5 free agent signings in Phillies history. Number 5, Kyle Schwarber. Number 4, Jim Thome. Number 3 is Pete Rose. Number 2, Zack Wheeler. And number 1 is Bryce Harper. Now, only one of those guys has a World Series title to their name, and it's Pete Rose. You would hope that Harper, Wheeler, and Schwarber have an opportunity still to do so, but that, of course, remains to be seen. Big thank you to everybody in today's chat. Again, K-Red, Steve Garrison, let's go back a little bit, BC, Ben Ace, Scott, who else am I missing? Terry Evans. To answer the question that was asked in the beginning of the year, in the beginning of the show, who's a better hitter, Kepler or Stott? I don't know if you're asking for this year or in totality. I think statistically speaking, Kepler's had a better career so far. If you're asking me for who do I think has a better 2025, I'm bullish on a Bryson Stott bounce back. And so I think I would say Bryson Stott. I'm interested in Kepler. Kepler intrigues me because if Kepler's good, this team could be offensively much better. Because we talked about it a couple weeks ago, the productivity you got from the left field position last year between Brandon Marsh and Austin Hayes and a bunch of other dudes, Whit Merrifield, it was terrible. And so if Kepler can be serviceable or better, I think it brings a buoy to this team. It brings a floor that would raise. But if you're asking me who do I feel better in, maybe having a bounce back year, I would choose Bryson Stott. So everybody in the chat, thank you so much for joining us today. You can, of course, catch this podcast at any time on YouTube, or you can catch the audio version of it on all of the podcast platforms, Apple, Spotify, all of the ones that I've never heard of before but apparently exist. No disrespect to those platforms, of course. You can watch them and listen at your convenience. A big thank you today for producing today's show to Brenna and Joey. Appreciate both of you guys enormously. Brenna, you're at 4 o'clock today with the Flyers podcast, and knowing Bill the way that I know Bill, he's probably got a lot to shout about after last night's game. So Brenna, Godspeed and the best to you, and thank you so much for stepping in and producing today's show. We'll be back on Monday for a half an hour live podcast. And of course, you can check out all of the video on demand content throughout the week. You can check that out at your leisure on PHLY and hit the subscribe button on the way out. If you wouldn't mind, just drop a like on this video before you get out of here as well. I'll check in with all of our diehards on the Discord over the weekend. Enjoy Phillies baseball, Phillies spring training baseball this weekend. I'll be back with you on Monday morning at 8 a.m. with John Marks. And then, of course, PHLY Phillies podcast here at 1 o'clock. Have a great weekend, everybody, and we will talk to you on Monday.
We all silly like the mayor.